Hey, in this video, I'm going to show you how to upcycle a pair of worn out pants into a tote bag with a zipper. So let's go. My partner rides his bicycle a lot, so the seat of his pants got blown out over time from all that friction. This is why bike riders wear a lot of spandex, and this was too damaged to patch. So I was saving these pants for a project like this one. And the very first thing I did was to cut right below the damaged seat of the pants. Next, I got my seam ripper, and starting at the very top of the cut, I went down the side seam to open it up even further. It took a little while, but I kind of got a groove finally. When I got to the very bottom of the pant leg to the cuff, I did the same thing with my seam ripper and just opened up the seam at the cuff of the pants. Once I finished all the seam ripping, I used a really hot iron to press out all of those creases that had been there from those old seams. So I just took my time and tried to get it nice and flat. When I finished ironing, I folded the pant leg up on itself so I could find two rectangles that would be the same size. And I just wanted to get as much fabric out of this pant leg as I could. And I used a ruler to draw a nice straight line so that I could cut two straight rectangles out of the pant leg. I noticed that there was a weak spot on one of the rectangles. That's probably where the knee of my partner's leg used to hit. And I decided to seam rip one of the pockets off of the seat part of the pants so that I could reinforce that kind of weak spot and make a little exterior pocket on my bag. So I just went through the same process and carefully cut the threads off of the pocket. Here's that really worn out spot that was at the knee of the pant legs. I just went ahead and pinned the pocket right over that weak spot. Well, I forgot to film it, but I did sew the pocket onto that piece of pant leg fabric. I got my measuring tape and figured out how large these two rectangles were. And I wrote that down. I ended up getting 19 inches of width and 15 3/4 height for each of my rectangles. Now I know this is kind of hard to see, but I got some white fabric to use as the liner of my bag, and I just cut it to the same size as the rectangles from the pant legs. So these were also 19 inches wide and 15 3/4 inches tall. I decided I wanted to create a zipper closure for this bag. Sometimes you just want to toss your bag in your trunk of your car or on your bike and not worry about things bouncing out. So to figure out how long of a zipper I needed, I basically subtracted a few inches from the full width of my fabric and just sort of eyeballed what seemed like a good length. I decided on a 16-inch zipper. And I don't have a 16-inch zipper, so I cut a longer zipper down to size. Now this is a metal zipper, so I used my good scissors just to cut through the zipper tape. And then I used some office scissors to cut close to the metal teeth. These are not my nice fabric scissors. I actually messed these scissors up trying to cut a metal zipper. But basically I am cutting right through the cord. There's like a fabric cord that runs between the metal teeth. I'm not actually cutting any metal, but I like to use my older scissors to get close to those metal teeth and just sort of just cut that one cord on both sides of the teeth. Next, I found a scrap of fabric from the pants that would be large enough to cover the cut end of my zipper. Then I sewed the right side of the scrap of fabric onto the right side of the zipper. And I always do a hand crank when I get near my metal teeth so that I can move and make sure I'm not putting the needle right into the metal, but I can thread that needle between the metal teeth. Once the scrap was attached to one side of the zipper, I just flipped it over and folded the scrap and tucked in the raw edge and sewed it again onto the back side of the zipper. Again, making sure not to sew right into metal, but carefully hand cranking my needle around those teeth. Then I went ahead and trimmed off the sides of the scrap so that this little scrap end was the same width as my whole zipper. These are the 4 pieces of fabric that I used to make my gussets. Each one of these strips is 18 inches wide and 2.5 inches tall. And you could definitely adjust this to make it a larger gusset if you want, or even smaller. And I went ahead and placed these pieces of fabric with the right sides together, and then I sewed around 3 sides. Oh, and I used about a 1/4 inch seam allowance on my fabric gussets. Once I finished sewing, I turned the gussets right side out and I pushed out those corners with the chopstick, and I folded in the raw edge about 1/4 inch on each of the gussets, and then I pressed the gussets so that they laid nice and flat. Next, I got the zipper in between the gussets on both sides and I pinned it in place. Now, if I were to do this again, I would actually pin the gussets a little bit further away from the teeth than I did, because it makes the zipper a little bit stiff. The zipper is sort of rubbing up against the fabric sometimes. So just be mindful and try not to get your teeth too close to the edge of your fabric. I switched out my standard presser foot for my zipper foot so I could get closer to the zipper teeth, and I went ahead and I sewed the gusset onto the zipper. And like I said, if I were to do this over, I would actually move the fabric a little bit further away from the zipper teeth. It still works, it's just a little bit, every now and then it's sort of, it just doesn't open great sometimes. Now I grabbed my liner fabrics and I measured from the top edge, I measured down 1.5 inches and I made some marks. I did this on both of my liner fabrics, and then I pinned my gusset so that the right side of the zipper was touching the right side of the liner fabric. Now I'm working with white, so there's not really a wrong side or a right side, but if you have a print, you want to make sure that you are pinning the zipper at the top edge on the right side of your liner. At the sewing machine, I put my standard presser foot back on and I sewed the gussets onto the fabric using about 1/8 inch seam allowance. And I did make sure to back stitch at the start and the stop of each of my seams. So here's what the liner pieces look like now that the gusset is attached. It looks a little funny, a little awkward at this point, but I promise it's right. So what I did next was I lined up the right sides of the liner fabric with each other and I pinned them along the sides. I made sure the gusset was tucked down out of the pins, out of the way, sort of down into the liner pocket, and just took my time and pinned around 3 sides. Once it's pinned, it's time to sew. And I used a 3/8 inch seam allowance on my liner fabric. I went around all 3 sides and I made sure not to catch the gusset in my seam. Once the liner pieces were done, I set those aside and I got my outer pieces of fabric out and I put them with the right sides together and I pinned along all 3 sides. Oh, and I almost forgot, but I did remember to put a no trace tag in between the outer layers of fabric, just a couple inches away from the top edge. You know what's happening next. It's time to sew where I pinned. Again, I used a 3/8 inch seam allowance on my outer fabrics, and I sewed around 3 sides, just following my pins. Now it's time to box those corners. I drew a 2-inch square on each of the bottom corners for my liner fabric and my outer fabric. And the way I like to box corners is to mark out that square and then open up the corner to make a little pointy triangle and feel inside that the seams are touching each other. They're lined up nicely and the fabric's laying really flat. And then I just pin and take it over to the machine. I sewed right along the line that I marked on all 4 corners, and I just leave the fabric on. If you have a project you want for those corners, you should definitely cut them off and save them, but I have a lot of scraps to work with right now, so I just leave my corners in place. Now it's time to make the straps, and I decided to use the other pant leg to make the straps for this bag, but you could definitely use different fabric or even just buy some strap material instead. But I went ahead and I seam ripped the other pant leg, which took about 10 minutes, and I decided to use that. This project got a little bit messy, so I had to take a moment every now and then and sweep up all the little threads that were popping off everywhere. Once the second pant leg was opened up and I had pressed out the old seams and hems really well, I measured out a rectangle that was 24 inches long and 8 inches wide to use for the straps. Now you could definitely adjust your rectangle if you want shorter straps. I wouldn't go much more narrow than 8 inches though if you're making your own straps, because it's a little more comfortable on your shoulders if the strap's about 1 inch or so wide. Then I cut that rectangle in half. So now it was 24 by 4 inches. I had 2 24 by 4 inch rectangles. Those 2 rectangles are going to become my straps. And I folded them in half lengthwise and pressed them. And then I opened up where I just ironed, and I folded the raw edges in towards that new center crease and pressed and folded again and pressed, kind of like when you're making bias tape. There's got to be a name for this sort of folding, ironing process, but basically you're trying to get it down to a 1-inch strap. Over at the sewing machine, I sewed the straps closed with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance or top stitch, and then I flipped the straps around and I sewed the other side so that I had 2 nice lines of top stitching on each of my straps. Now it's time to put the inner panels with the outer panels and with the straps. So I turned the inner panels right side out and I folded the gusset down, and I left the outer panels wrong side out. I put the inside panels into my outside panels, and I lined up the side seams from the inner pieces and the outer pieces. I lined them up with each other, and I put a pin on each of the side seams, and then I put a few more pins to keep the liner fabric up, touching the top edge of the outer fabric, because that gusset is kind of going to want to pull down on your liner fabric. Then I got the straps and I put one strap in between 2 of the layers, and I pinned the strap 5 inches away from the side seams. And I did that for both of the straps, obviously, so that they would be in the same place on my bag. At the machine, I went ahead and sewed all around the top edge of the bag to join those inner and outer layers with each other. I used a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I also made sure to sew over the straps with 3 rows of stitches so the straps would be nice and secure. And then I also left an opening of about 3 or 4 inches near one of the sides of the bag so that I could turn the whole bag right side out. This is the almost grand finale, always one of my most favorite parts. I turned the bag right side out through the opening that I left on the side, and then I tucked the liner fabric into the bag where it's supposed to be, and I also rolled out that top seam so it would lay nice and flat, and I went ahead and pressed the opening so that I could more easily top stitch that opening closed. I just did a little finger pressing there at the opening, and I put some pins in it to keep it lined up nicely before I took it to the machine. It's top stitch time. I took my time and went all the way around the top edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance to close up that opening and also give the bag a little bit more of a polished look, which is always fun. And then the last thing to do is to trim those loose threads off your bag. I am super happy with this bag. It's a really great size. It's large enough for a laptop and some notebooks or as an overnight bag. I'm pretty sure my daughters are going to be wanting to borrow this all the time. And it's just a really fun way to upcycle these pants. I have a whole playlist of upcycling projects, so I'm going to link to that right here.